Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the game between David Smerdon and um, the game between Wojtaszek. And this comes from the 2016 Chess Olympiad in Baku. And this was between Australia, represented by Smerdon, with the white pieces, and Poland, represented by the black pieces, GM Wojtaszek. And I chose to do this game because a few rounds ago, Smearden uh, played Magnus Carlsen, and with the white pieces, he was able to muster a draw. But it was an exciting game, and it was in a rare opening at GM level. Smearden had played his favorite C3 Sicilian, and here he is again with the white pieces against another strong grandmaster. Vodacek is rated 2736, smeared in 2531. And this game is a case of someone basically, I guess, going to draw water from the same well one too many times, and eventually the well runs dry. And you get to see here a good demonstration of how uh, a prepared GM deals with the C3 Sicilian. Now, as usual, I like to show a quick miniature so that uh, the amateur players, the novice players in the beginning can get a relative grasp on what white is trying to do, excuse me, in this opening. So first, I just want to get to the C3 Sicilian. So E4 C, excuse me, E4 C5, Knight F3, D6. Now, to be technical, the C3 Sicilian usually starts right here, and then Black's main continuations are either D5, exploiting the fact that once this pawn captures here, so for example, after D5, E takes D5, the queen can safely occupy the center without being harassed from this knight. It's the main idea behind that. And white has to be willing to enter into isolated queen pawn positions, because after the move D4, eventually this C pawn will exchange itself, and you end up with a position that looks like this with this isolated pawn. Now, of course, I just did it with not the correct timing, because you don't want the knight coming out this soon and hitting the queen. But what the heck? Let me show you. So after queen d5, play could go d4, and let's say e6, knight f3, knight f6, excuse me, bishop d3, knight c6, castle, and now c takes d4, c takes d4, bishop e7, knight c3, queen d6, and there's a lot of similarity between these moves in the Scandinavian defense also. Knight b5 and queen d8. And for example, bishop f4 can take place. Knight d5, defending and attacking. Bishop g3, castle, rook c1, more pressure on the c file. Bishop d7, bishop e4, and knight c b4. And this game is equal. And this game was this position arose from the game John Grief and Roman Zenzi Kashvili with the black pieces from Lone Pine 1980. So if you want to check that game out, it's from Lone Pine 1980. And but here's the typical isolated queen pawn position. White has his open files, and he has a nice lot of pieces on the board, so there's potential for activity. But black is solid enough, and black would like to drag this out into an endgame where he's working on that pawn. So that's the main idea behind that early d5 from black. The other main move is knight f6. This is akin to an Alapin defense, which is also akin to Scandinavian defense. The idea here is to attack the e pawn in a different way. Instead of using the d pawn and threaten like that, threaten with the piece, practically forcing black to move, or white to move the pawn up. Again, akin to Alapin's defense. The knight comes here at d4, and c takes d4, c takes d4, d6, immediately attacking the center. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight b6, bishop b5. Again, it's all about fighting for these squares. D takes e5, exclamation mark, and of course white would like to take with the pawn, but queens would be traded off here. So knight takes e5, threatening to win a pawn here. Bishop d7, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and after knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight c3, e6, the game was equal. And this game was from Sveshnikov, one of the strong proponents of this opening, Evgeny Sveshnikov, also of Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian fame, versus the late great Walter Brown, and this was from Novi Sad 1979. And again, we see the isolated queen pawn position, and that's offset by, of course, this isolated pawn of blacks on the open file. Again, that game was equal. Okay, so now, before we get to the game between Smerdon and Wojtaszek, again, thank you for your patience. Like and subscribe, please. I'm going to show you a game from Grandmaster Bortnik, who's a proponent of this line also, and he's only about 20 years old right now, 19 or 20. He's up and coming GM, and he actually smashed Grandmaster Wojtaszek in this opening in 2014. So Wojtaszek is well versed in this opening, and I'm going to show you that game real quick. It's a miniature, right? But it's amazing how Wojtaszek plays in that game, and that game must have had an effect on how he played against Smerdon in this game. So let's look at that. I'll be brief as possible because I know you want to be able to get to it. All right. Let me see something here. Okay, that game started out e4, c5, and the main difference here is c3 right away. In the Smerdon game, Smerdon played knight f3, which it looks like white is gonna go into a regular normal Sicilian, but c3 kind of tips his hand. And here Wojtaszek, again, this is the game Bortnik Wojtaszek. This is from the European Rapid 2014, and we see that move I just showed you about d5 from Wojtaszek. Queen takes d5, d4, knight f6, Bishop e3. This is an interesting move because right away, white is trying to force the issue with this central pawn. He wants to force black to play this so that he can then play c takes d4 and then bring his knight out to c3. So he actually threatens the pawn. Bishop g4, threatening the queen from Wojtaszek. And of course, he's not afraid of a move like c3, which will just weaken the king side and slow white's development. So, queen b3 is played. Now, if the natural looking knight f3, c takes, bishop takes, g takes, e6, knight f3. Notice now the knight can be pinned. Rook to the g file, attacking the g pawn. And we see that black is just fine. White has the two bishops, but his pawns are something terrible. So Bortnick opts for the endgame. And it's interesting because you might say, wow, isn't this supposed to be an attacking system? Well, it can be, but opts for the endgame. So queen takes on b3. White's pawns are doubled, and it seems as if black has nothing to worry about. But white is able to maintain a slight initiative here. Again, he's still threatening this pawn. So takes, bishop takes. This is important also. Notice the 3 to 2 pawn majority on the king side. Excuse me, queen side. Knight c6. There's a pin. This is a very important move. Fight for the initiative here. a6, attacking the bishop. White gives up his bishop here. Now, this position might look dry here, but it's actually a very critical position here because black can attack this pawn here. That's really his only target, whereas white has this target here, and this one. And it seems that it's easier for white to attack black's targets than it is for the other way around. So let's see how the game went. So we see those weak c and a pawns. Knight d2 is played. Excuse me. And now knight d7. Black's plan, black wants to liberate itself, so he's thinking about moves like c5 or e5. Somehow knight d2. So knight d7. Knight f3. Playing against e5, preventing that move. So therefore, Wojtaszek plays f6 so that he can force in this move e5, and then get this bishop out also. So h3, bishop to f5. White castles, and notice that white's pieces are very well placed and look natural in their positions. Last move for white to complete his development is probably just a move like rook e1, and then it looks like a picturesque position as white's pieces seem to be well placed, whereas we see the lag in development from black and the awkwardness of the position. Seems like black is having difficulty finding good places for the pieces. So he finally gets in his e5. Bishop drops to e3. Bishop e7, rook a4. And this is what I was talking about. This pawn being on the open file like this, the assault is easy for white to commit because this rook will just come here. And how to defend that pawn. Meanwhile, although white has this weakness right here, he has different ways of defending this. He already has a knight here. And maybe in some circumstances he can just simply push to b4. So his weakness is a little bit easier to defend than blacks. So knight c5, double attack here, takes, and Bortnick had no problem giving up the bishop here, and that pawn is under attack. A pawn, how to defend. So he has to undevelop a piece. And now, and look how simple Bortnick makes it look. He switches his attack from a6 to the bishop on c5. The bishop is forced to move, and white simply wins a pawn. And this is a strong grandmaster that he did this against. He made it look really, really, really simple. Okay, so the king comes out. We're back, and I'm just gonna go through these moves a bit faster because this is not the main game right here. But I just wanted to show you Wojtaszek's experience as black on the losing side against this opening, a dangerous opening. We see the rook to the second, seventh, knight coming in now. Desperation from black, wanting to trade off pieces. Knight d4 check. A beautiful move right here. And the idea is pretty simple. If e takes, then the rook on d1 will go to the e file with check, and then both rooks will appear on the 7th rank after the bishop on d7 is captured. And he actually did it, so there it is. So instead of taking with this rook and perhaps allowing a trade of pieces, he wants to keep his pieces on, so he does that. And the rest is just a clean up job, and Wojtaszek lost the game here. Now let's go to our feature. Again, GM Smerdon, specialist in this opening with the white pieces. So after e4, c5, knight f3. Again, the main difference and a very important one is this move c3. And I wish that Smerdon had just played c3 against him, but perhaps he was worried about preparation. So instead, he played knight f3, which allows black to go into a more normal looking setup. It gives white the flexibility too of eyeing out a favorable setup for himself. Maybe he likes to play against his pawn structure. So he plays c3. The idea is real simple. This c3 idea is the idea of building up a strong center, two-pawn center, and it's the same in many other openings. Whether you take the Gioco piano, right, for the beginners, let's show them that real quick. Right, whether you take Gioco piano, same idea is to try to build up the double center here, and we're not going to discuss its merits, whether it's weak or not, just to show you the idea. Same idea in the Ruy Lopez here. sorry about that. I messed up the move order. After rook e1. There we go. So that pawn is threatened. Let's see. Let's play d6, 3, castle, and c3 again. The same idea. And like say you're going to the old school Shigorn variation. Let's see, c5. Same idea is to build up the dual center. So back to the game. Oh, also we can't forget the the Ponziani variation with the same idea. Okay, enough of that. You get the point. White is trying to build up a a strong center with two pawns in it, as opposed to your classical Sicilian, where after d6, uh, d4, c takes d4, and white only has one pawn in the center, and black has the pawn preponderance in the center. So c3. Of course, the downside is that it deprives the knight of its natural square. So let's keep going. Knight f6, attacking the pawn. Bishop e2. Did Smerdon just overlook the capture of the pawn? Of course not. If knight takes e4, then check. The queen. So make it real for you. They check, and the piece gets captured for free. Okay, so g6, castles, bishop g7. Smerdon decides to check. Knight c6, d4. So there he is. He has his goal of his two-pawn center. Now white finally castles. Again, this really cannot be taken because of this move right here. So it's just not happening. And after a6, then you got a double attack here. Bishop's attacking the knight on e4, and the pawn is attacking this knight. Okay. So castles. Now the pawn after castle. Now this pawn is really under threat. So rook e1. C takes d4. C takes d4. So you might say, hey, doesn't white have exactly what he wants here? Nice center. Yes, it is true. But the question is, it's not just about having possession of the center, because now that you have your pawns in the center, those pawns must be maintained. They must be guarded. You know, in other words, it's kind of like if you buy a new house, right? The house must be maintained, right? It must be, bills must be paid. Electricity has to be paid, right? The mortgage, whatever, your heat, hot water, those things have to be paid. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there's responsibility. Now that you have those two pawns there, you have to make those two pawns strong. So if they're strong, then they're a great asset. But if they're weak, they become a liability to the person or the player that holds those pawns. So just throwing two pawns in the center in itself is nothing. It can go either way. It can be good or bad depending on the circumstance. So basically what white is saying here is, I'm going to give you your two pawn center, but I'm going to prove to you that it's not an asset to you, it's a liability. White is saying, I'm going to make this an asset. Now what I want to do is I want to share with you something from the great player Aaron Nimzovich in his book Blockader. And he says, to summarize, the fundamental motives of the pawn advance in the center. He gives three reasons basically for moving pawns in the center. A. Demobilization of the opponent. What does that mean? That means, for instance, if I get my pawn here, I can force this knight to move. In other words, I lessen the value of the pieces, right? I lessen the scope. I demobilize them. In other words, if I say I force this knight back here, then this rook can't move now. I create a cramped situation. I demobilize the pieces. I make it hard for them to move. Okay, that's the first reason for moving the pawn to the center. Second, he gives opening of lines, which means basically, say for instance, you play e4, e5 with the idea of capturing, opening of lines. It's definitely important when the king is in the then the king's in the center. The third reason. Let's get to the bishop. I'm sorry. The third reason is restraint through the wedge formation. Let me just show you what the wedge formation is. Here's a good example of the wedge formation. So for instance, e4, e6, d4, d5. Actually, let's see. Let's go through it like this. Let's use knight f3, d5, g3. This is a good way. Okay, e6, castles, knight f6, d3, and say bishop e7, knight f3, knight f6, e4, castle, e5. Right now, I didn't use the best move orders and such, but I just wanted to give you an example. This is a wedge in a position, and what it does is it kind of cuts the board in half, and it makes it hard for black to switch its pieces over from each side of the board. For instance, it's hard to get pieces from the king side to the queen side, and from the queen side to the king side. So it forces almost a detour in the position for black, and the wedge formation can be very, very annoying. You might be able to notice it's hard to play moves like f6, for instance, because of the pressure. A lot of times there's pressure on this pawn. For instance, this queen would be here already, and then when f6 is played, the idea to take with all this pressure here makes it hard for black to break free. So those are the three fundamental motives of the pawn advance in the center: demobilization of the opponent, opening lines, and restraint through wedge formation. So before you say this position is good for white, we have to see how it actually works in a practical sense. Like it looks good. Like the old school chess players, maybe like Tarish or something, would say, "Oh, white has an advantage." But again, if all your pieces are tied up defending these pawns, then they're not. They are just a liability. You know, it's just like, again, using a house analogy. A house can be an asset or a liability, right? If you paid your house off, you own your house, and you know your equity is built up on your house, you took good care of it and stuff, then it's an asset. But if you're like drowning in debt, and the house is underwater, so to speak, then it's a liability, because you have to use all your energy just to keep it going. And that's how we can judge these pawn centers. So let's see. Bishop g4 is played. So now you already see the attack on the center. The attack is swift and immediate, because black doesn't want to give white any time to solidify the center, to reinforce it. When I say solidify, I mean reinforce it, establish it so that it cannot be broken down. And all white needs is a few moves to be able to do that. If he could get these pieces out, and influence the center. For instance, had this guy here, maybe this guy here, maybe rook here, queen here, or something, and reinforce the center would be very strong. But notice what Wojtaszek does. So bishop g4. So already there's an idea of capturing the knight, drawing the queen here, and taking here. Basic idea. d5. So now he provokes an advance from black. Now, excuse me, from white. Now look at the center. The center is not as strong anymore. Right? Now remember what we said about demobilization of the opponent. Does this move demobilize this knight? No, not here, because this knight can just jump into the center. So that's a fail as far as that's concerned. Let's look at what else happened with the move d5. Dark squares are weakened. Black has a beautiful dark square bishop, and that's strengthened. So in my eyes, all I see is I see black as a beneficiary of this move. Although white has gained some space, again, are these pawns strong or weak? Let's see. So knight e5 now. So now you got a double attack here. Bishop e2. Now we see this pawn is temporarily undefended, but there's tactics here. So for instance, if knight takes, this knight will capture this knight, and then this bishop be on prise. So there's tactics, but nevertheless the pawn is still not adequately defended. Let's see what happens. So knight takes f3, bishop takes f3. Now again, we're talking about strengthening in the center. Maybe g takes f3. It's better gaining tempo on a bishop, although I still think the game would be equal. But bishop takes f3 was played with a threat to capture the bishop. So bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. And again, it's all about the center. White is trying to fortify this center. He's behind in development. Knight d7, still attacking. Knight wants to come here, harass the queen, and he opens up this diagonal right here. Knight c3. So we see the fortification from white. Problem is though, is he's weakened these dark squares really badly. Rook c1, and now we see pressure building up against the c3 square. So now we have two pieces there. Bishop g5, white trying to complete his development. He put some pressure here so that the queen can't move easily. So h6, h4. So Smerdon is stubborn. He wants to stay on that, on that pawn right here on e7. Knight e5, attacking the queen. Queen to e2. And perhaps with ideas of playing f4. And then we can start thinking about those motives of the pawn advance in the center again. Again, demobilizing of the opponent. Right? Opening of lines, etc. So let's see. Black has to be active here. So with that in mind, you had to think of something active. I mean, f4 is coming. and there's an active move. Threat, this knight takes here, because again, this piece is under pressure from the rook on c8 and the bishop on g7. So now white is simply threatening, black is simply threatening the winning pawn. So white has to deal with that threat. So now white deals with that. So black black has to be active here. Because you remember, he's trying to prove that that white's center is suspect. That is not a strong center, but in fact it's a weak center. Wojtaszek plays g5. What does g5 do? Besides just attacking the bishop, yes, he slightly weakens his king side, but black is determined that there's really no threat of king side attack here from white that he has to worry about. So what he does with g5 is he protects this pawn and allows this queen to be able to move on this diagonal now. Because before, the pawn was under attack by the bishop, but now with the g5, that pawn is protected and this queen is free to move, and this allows this rook to get into the game. Bishop g3. And queen a5. Look at all the pressure here. So now you got 1, bishop on g7, 2, queen a5, and via x-ray you have 3, rook on c8, all putting great amount of pressure on this knight. And you have this threat here. Now again, rook e to d1, some more pressure. Now the threat against the b pawn. Rook c2. And notice how white is having to play these defensive maneuvers. And again, has white center been of any value at all? Of course not. Has white center demobilized the opponent? Has he opened lines? Have these pawn advances, has any lines been open? Has there been any restraint through wedge formation? Not at all. Black has simply played around all of these ideas, and it's white who is actually weak in the center. Even though he has 2 pawns in the center, white's pawns are a liability that now have to be protected somehow. Meanwhile, black doesn't really have any pawns in the center at all, but yet exercises great influence because of his bishop on g7 and his knight on c4. Rook c7. Alright, looks like a double up coming. Rook dc1. And now, great move by Wojtaszek. Finally takes the pawn. So rook takes. It's like, hey, has black made a mistake? The queen's being attacked. But Wojtaszek has seen that white's back rank is a little suspect. So he plays a fantastic move here. Simply rook takes c3. Back rank problems. If rook takes b4, I'm sure you can see that, then simply rook takes c1 will occur. And then that forces us into this ending right here. So rook d1 from Smerdon. He still has attack the queen, offering endgame possibility here. Notice the 2-to-1 majority for black on the queen side. Smerdon goes in for the ending. That pawn's attacked. Remember, I was talking about the liability. now the center that had such a promising future at the beginning of the game is being attacked. So there's two attacks here. The rook on b2 and the center. Wojtaszek is willing to give up his b pawn for the e pawn. And that's what happens. Rook takes b7. Wojtaszek plays bishop to f6. Guards this pawn. Willing to part with this pawn. Sacrifices the pawn. D takes e5. So again, White's once mighty center is now almost vanished. His isolated queen's pawn will definitely be up for grabs. Smerdon grabs a7, and now this pawn can be dangerous and must be watched. Now we see the bishop being harassed right here. And if you've been following my videos, you will know about the different ways to deal with bishops. Even though I specifically talk about fianchetto bishops, is basically general principles of playing against pieces. In the case of bishops, either you blockade the bishop, either you pursue a scorched earth policy where you give the bishop no targets, or you simply trade it off. In this instance, Wojtaszek is blockading the bishop. You see this bishop has no scope. And right now, black's own bishop is blockaded. Well, let's look a few moves ahead and see what happens to these two bishops in the future. So f3 is played. And the idea is, of course, to be able to escape after being attacked. Rook takes over the open file. And this rook wants to come to the second rank and start to wreak havoc. Okay, so now rook e1. Double attack here. And this pawn. And there it is. So white could care less about this pawn because he knows he can double up and start to win material. h3. Powerful move by Wojtaszek, opening the bishop, but specifically with the threat of stopping here, checking the king, and winning the rook. So there's the check to get out of that. King g7, and he takes. F takes e4. So it looks like that black miscalculated here, but he did not miscalculate. The theme is very, 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 very common to sacrifice material to open up lines for your pieces, and that's what happened with this move right here. This bishop comes to life when this pawn was moved to e4. So if Wojtaszek didn't miscalculate or didn't see that this idea could easily be pushed aside by the check, it wasn't like he missed a simple maneuver. But chess is a game of force, and he realized that white must react to this idea. So in his calculations, he saw that he would lose his pawn, but he saw that this bishop would come alive. So after king g7 and f takes e4, we see that it is white that is up a pawn here. And we see too, it looks like white has his center back. But again, is it weak or strong? Let's see what happened. So rooks double up. Rook takes g2, threatening the bishop. And there's a black's powerful bishop coming in to the game. Attacking the bishop. Bishop attacks the rook. And notice from that little pawn sacrifice, we see how dangerous this bishop has become. Rook c1. And rook e2. The idea is real simple again, dealing with the back rank. If rook takes c3, then this rook comes down and mates. Or this rook. So he brings the other rook to attack. Rook c4. Rook takes b8. Rook 4 takes c3. And this is just devastating. Although the pawn count is equal, we see 1, 2, 3 pawn islands for white. And all black's pawns are together. So all of these pawns are just nothing but weaknesses. And to boot, there's 2 rooks on the 7th rank, or the 2nd rank rather. So rook g3, king g6, rook a1, playing the push. And we see now that the once great mighty center, white, just simply at the end proves to be a liability. a4. Again, the devastating use of the 2nd rank. And this is white basically asking for a draw here, because we all know that this pawn is not going to queen without at least a perpetual check. So white is hoping for that to happen. So here comes black's pawns now. f5, a5, f4, and of course Wojtaszek probably calculated all of this. Okay, so d6, e takes d6, and it's only fitting that, because this game has been pretty much about the center, but it's only fitting that white ends the game and he doesn't have any central representation whatsoever. Although at the beginning of the game he started out with c3 and eventually had pawns on d4 and e4, but by move 45 he has no central representation whatsoever. So after d6, e takes d6, a6, g4, h takes g4, h takes g4. He moves out of the corner there because he's about to get mated. So king g1, check, and white resigned. There's really nothing for him here. One of these pawns are going to be used as an anchor, and white is just going to get mated. So we could say today that Smerdon ran out of luck. But I do wish he did go with the regular c3 Sicilian to see what Wojtaszek would have played. I wonder if he would have played d5 like he had played against Bortnik and had lost. But anyway, no use crying over spilled milk. So that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed the analysis. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. And please like and subscribe. All right. See you on the next one.